What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for BioShock Infinite, after playing through it entirely for the first time just this year, as well as the previous two games just a couple of months ago. Infinite, however, leaves the underwater city of Rapture for a city in the clouds known as Columbia, while also making a number of gameplay changes that in many ways make it feel more like a standard first-person shooter. However, before we dive into the full review, to get my usual spiel out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything I cover, you can go to my channel page, and it'll be the first video you see if you are not subscribed, or you can just click the link down in the description below, alongside a link to my Steam profile, which is also public. That said, speaking of achievements, for this particular game, the only one that was really difficult was a DLC achievement called Blue Ribbon Champ that sees you completing an optional objective in every battle arena that is included with that DLC, and we'll talk a little more about that later. If anything, I would say it was just super tedious more than difficult, though. Towards the beginning of the review, however, there are a few things I want to note about getting this game running and just how it's faring roughly 10 years on, as this game was originally released all the way back in 2013. That said, it was also released as part of a collection that remastered the first two games while leaving this one largely the same back in 2016. Just a few years prior, though, 2K made the strange decision to add the 2K launcher to all of the Steam release versions of this game. However, they did so in an incredibly unobtrusive way that means you just have to click play on the launcher. You don't have to sign in, you don't have to make an account, which makes the decision to add it that much more baffling. But if you are on Steam, you can set the launch options to bypass that entirely, just like the other two as well. Beyond that, though, the game ran for me very well. It didn't crash, I didn't really have any issues. The only thing of note on the technical state of things really was that if you want to play this game in 4K these days, because it did not receive a remaster, you're going to struggle with the UI, which has no scaling option in-game. Bizarrely, though, you don't need to download a mod or anything to fix this. You can simply go to wherever you have the game downloaded at, find the settings file where there will be an option to manually adjust it in the files simply by changing a couple of numbers in a text file, after which you should be good to go. If you're playing on less than 4K, that probably won't even be an issue for you, though. And as someone who plays a lot of 10-plus-year-old games, that is incredibly minor as far as issues that can pop up. Moving right along, though, let's talk about the difficulty of this game. Before we jump in and start a new game, we'll have to choose a difficulty. There are technically 4, but at first you'll only have the option of 3, which is easy, normal, and hard. After completing the game or inputting a cheat code, you can jump into 1999 mode, which is the game's sort of ultra-difficult mode, though really it's not that bad. Most of what this affects is your health, how much damage you take, alongside the accuracy of the enemies firing at you. Even on 1999 difficulty, most of the game is not that hard until you get to the last couple of fights, which can just simply overwhelm you with numbers, at which point you'll need to be a bit more familiar with the game's mechanics. Though, as this game is kind of old, you can find plenty of guides out there for exactly every situation you can think of in this relatively short game, so all in all, that difficulty is not that bad. On the topic of difficulty, though, one of the DLCs, the second part of Burial at Sea, has another optional difficulty mode called 1998 mode, which forces you to do a non-lethal run, which is possible in that DLC, and honestly also not that difficult. If anything, it just helps you lean into the more stealth approach of said DLC. From there, though, let's talk about the story setup of BioShock Infinite, as I think it's one of the most intriguing, let's say, parts of it. Our character, Booker DeWitt, starts the game by being brought to a lighthouse after being given the task of finding a young woman to wipe away his gambling debts, as he is in debt to people you really don't want to be in debt to. This ultimately sends him to the city in the clouds, Columbia, which, while originally meant to be a World's Fair setup that highlighted American exceptionalism in this alternative timeline, they later got involved with a local dispute and seceded from the United States, becoming their own city-state in the clouds. Since then, the city has turned into a theocratic police state where they all worship the Prophet. And while everything might seem rosy and cheerful at first, the game very quickly shows you who these people actually are and the terrible things they get up to despite the very shiny veneer on everything. That said, our job is to find a girl, which turns out to be Elizabeth. And shortly after this, we find out that she has reality warping powers and genuinely wants to escape the city. Naturally, things go from bad to worse as this all plays out, before a bunch of pieces involving all sorts of time manipulation fall into place to make a story that is about far more than someone trying to wipe away their gambling debts. And while I don't want to go into extensive detail for the sake of spoilers, mostly, but also for the fact that we'd likely be here all day if I tried to break down every little bit of it, there's a few things I want to mention. Overall, I didn't care for the actual narrative that much, but I loved the characters. Both our character, Booker DeWitt, and everything you find out about him towards the end of the game is incredibly interesting. Our main antagonist, Zachary Hale Comstock, the religious prophet that the city of Columbia reveres, is an incredibly interesting character as well, and we mostly hear about him through various audio logs and things like that we can pick up that kind of tell us about the person he is and how he raised Elizabeth in this tower she was stuck in. All contains a lot of really good writing. Elizabeth herself is probably one of the best companions I've had in video games, as she both helps us in combat by finding us various items, alongside just doing things for us like picking locks we couldn't pick ourselves, and actually being able to keep up with our character, for instance. All of which makes this, in many ways, extended escort mission not feel like an annoying escort mission, which I thought was really cool. Now, the thing I didn't like about all this was all of the time manipulation. While I don't think time manipulation is necessarily bad in and of itself, when you start doing things like time travel and messing with timelines, it tends to get in the way of your story, especially when we have already established things like what happened with BioShock 1 and 2. And while the DLC, Burial at Sea, goes on to, I would say, cap off the various loose ends that make this not a complete nightmare for a potential sequel, which is apparently in development, by the way, still doesn't feel great, because once you introduce time travel to a setting or a story, it tends to just be the default answer to anything, and it creates a lot of plot holes. Which means that while I think they did likely the best job they could have with a story that involves what they wanted to do, it does make a lot of the decisions and things that happen feel like they lack weight simply because an alternative timeline might very well change things. And because of that, I found it a little tough to get into. And that's before we even start talking about the lack of choices. While BioShock 1 and 2 didn't have a ton of choice, they did ultimately provide us with moral decisions that then gave us a different ending. We don't really see that here. We have one or two minor choices that don't affect anything, but that's about it. On one hand, though, because this particular story is set in 1912, roughly 50 years before the events of the other two games, and the fact that it involves this time travel, they really couldn't do a lot with the endings without, again, just retconning the whole series, which is another problem you get into when it comes to time travel and things like that. So because of that, while I think they did fine with it overall, I can't say I was a fan of the direction they chose to take the story here. Now, on to the progression systems at play. Many of the systems that we saw in the previous two games have been toned down and streamlined to fit the newer, sort of faster FPS-style gameplay. BioShock 1 and 2 were technically immersive sims. Very, very light in that department, but technically they were. Infinite here, however, I wouldn't really call an immersive sim at all. And as we talk about some of these stats and systems in play as we go over this, I think that'll become more and more apparent that most of this game is just an FPS, really. Now, progression-wise, we've got stats, weapons, gear, and vigors. Our stats are gained by finding infusions. There is a DLC that will grant a few of these right at the beginning of the game, which can be very helpful on later difficulties, but even without them, you can find like 25 of these. And when you find an infusion, you'll be able to pick between your health, shield, or salts. Salts being what we need to use our powers, and we can put 10 points into each. With the DLC that gives the extra infusions, you'll get close to maxing out all of these, but not quite. Of these, I would say shield is probably the biggest one to take note of, as it is exactly what it sounds like, a damage shield. However, if this shield gets broken and we wait a few seconds out of combat without getting hit, it will start to recharge, which means that unlike our health, Our shields replenish on their own and block us from damage, meaning that shields are pretty high value when it comes to upgrading. Salts, which are going to let us use all of our various vigor powers, are also very important because those are incredibly strong and things you definitely need to use on the higher difficulties like hard and 1999 mode. Beyond just our stats, though, we have weapons, of course. We'll find all sorts of weapons as we move through the game, especially when we start jumping timelines here and there. We can find different versions of essentially the same weapon, and each of these weapons can be upgraded at a vendor who will sell us 4 upgrades for every weapon, I believe it is, which will do things like give you better recoil, increase damage, the usual stuff. However, we can only carry 2 weapons with us at a time, which can be very limiting despite us doing all of these upgrades, and that in particular, I would say, did not feel great, only being able to carry around the 2. Then we have gear, though. This game does allow us to equip 4 pieces of gear. We don't actually ever see these, but they will provide various benefits, passives basically, depending on what we have equipped. Generally, you're just going to want to find passives that encourage the way you'd like to play the game, and you'll be good to go. Some of these are very impactful, some of them not so much. On easy and normal difficulties, you really won't even notice these. Last but not least, we have the Vigors. In place of plasmids, we have an earlier version of the same thing known as Vigors. There are 8 of them in total, and in some cases, they do basically the exact same thing they did in the earlier BioShocks, and a few of them function a little bit differently, but only in minor ways. Like Undertow is basically telekinesis, but it's a little more limited. Vigors can also be upgraded at a vigor vending machine where we can trade money for the upgrades, but each vigor also has a trap version of it that is usually incredibly strong. Sometimes this is just flat damage, other times it's more interesting things, but using and setting those traps is really only necessary again on higher difficulties. Beyond that, I found just using the power was typically more useful, but some of the harder fights in 1999 mode almost necessitate setting up those traps appropriately. For instance, we can set up shock jockey traps, the electricity power, that will then connect to each other and then make a sort of arc of electricity that will damage any enemies that pass through, and that one can be really helpful, which is just one of the fun things you can do. As for progression, though, that's basically it outside of story progression. From there, though, let's talk about the world and gameplay systems a bit. The gameplay of this title is essentially a linear shooter. If you were to play through the entire thing, doing just about everything you can, you're looking at like maybe 12 to 15 hours, depending on how quickly you're moving. But if you're being a little less thorough, you can get through this game much quicker than that. There's not a ton of exploration to be had. There are 1 or 2 levels that kind of let you bounce around a little bit, but for the most part, it's a very linear game. And after you play through it at least once, you can actually just load into chapters that the game is divided up into, which means that you can jump straight to the points you need to do something at, say for an achievement, things like that make it that much easier. So at least in that regard, the game doesn't really waste your time at all. And after that initial playthrough, you can kind of just go through and see specific things that you want to see. So that's a bit of how the game is structured, but let's talk about the world, the city of Columbia. As I mentioned earlier, this is effectively a theocratic police state among the stars. One thing that I do think this game does really well is making Columbia feel like a very unique world, which is obviously a decent amount because it's floating in the clouds, but it does offer a very different feeling than Rapture. Rapture felt very oppressive by its nature, both from the pressure of the situation as well as the water actually giving pressure to the environment. Whereas in Columbia, that pressure is much more subtle, as you are simply in a rather beautiful place where everything and everyone wants you dead. But one thing I really enjoy about the world of this place is how it is explained to you. As we move through the city, we can find both short little videos that explain various functions. We can find audio logs called voxophones that fill out all the lore and tell us about various characters, alongside just going to locations that allow you to see into the daily life of the people who lived here, and behind the, again, very pretty and shiny veneer that the city has, but ultimately fails to live up to. And that's before we even start talking about all of the cool, sort of almost retro steampunk innovations we see, such as all the various automaton enemies, the Patriot enemies, which are minigun-wielding, sort of patriotic American figures. But another great part about this is, again, running into all of the characters who were really well done. Elizabeth is kind of the star of the show here, as she is the big focus of both the story as well as much of the gameplay, as she provides several functions for you, as I mentioned as well. And all of that combines to make the world of BioShock Infinite interesting, even if it's definitely an awful place to actually live. But from there, let's talk a little bit about the combat of the title. As I've mentioned, this game is a first-person shooter first and foremost. That is where a lot of the action is, and it really is the bulk of the gameplay. On 1999 mode, you might spend more time scrounging for ammo, but even then, it's really not that bad. Now, the good news is, in that regard at least, it feels pretty fun to play around with. Many of the weapons you can find all feel unique and varied. Only one or two of them felt unfun to use, really. And then you combine those weapons with your vigor powers, which can be turned into various traps, as well as just played around with in general in terms of what they can do, such as the charge one, which allows you to sort of teleport to an enemy almost before blasting them with a shotgun, for instance, can set up a lot of really fun combos, and the vigors themselves can actually combo off of each other, which there is an achievement for, such as possessing an enemy and then hitting them with another type of vigor, such as the fireball one. So I think they got the feel of combat in a really fun place. There are still a few issues with it, in my opinion. For starters, they make the game a little too easy by allowing Elizabeth to toss you anything you need, basically. If you get low on health, she can toss you health kits. If you lose a lot of ammo for a weapon, she can toss you more of it. If you're down on salts for your vigor power, she can give you that. If you go to a vending machine and don't buy anything, she'll even give you money. And once you kind of find out where those triggers are, you can play around with and sort of manipulate them to your advantage, which isn't really necessary per se, but it makes the combat trivial in many instances. And on basically everything besides 1999 mode, it makes it incredibly easy because you're just handed everything you need the second you run out of it, which really emphasizes that first-person shooter combat, but even then, I don't have to scrounge for ammo, I don't have to worry about running out of it. It's basically just how well I can chain these kills together and how well I can react to what enemies are doing. And this is another area of the game that, in my opinion, falls short a little bit of the first two, where scrounging resources and trying to make it through this labyrinthine city felt like more of an ordeal, whereas here it feels like a shooting gallery most of the time. But as for the feel of combat, it's pretty good. I can't really fault it there. It's just that it's very different from what the other two games in the series set up, and moves the game in a direction that I don't feel like was a great representation of the rest of what BioShock is up to this point, which is what I would say is my main complaint. That does, however, bring us to the DLC section of the video. There are a few DLCs, but the three most important ones are the 2 parts to Burial at Sea, which expands on the main story, and the Clash in the Clouds DLC, a sort of arena system. Burial at Sea taken together is really cool. They actually bring us back to Rapture, and it connects the story of this game back to the original 2 and sort of closes off a lot of the loopholes that the time manipulation mechanics brought to the series. So in that way, I was kind of glad to see it, but also a lot of the content in the DLC is just really cool. The first one is mostly more of the same, with you simply being in Rapture this time instead, but also introducing a few new cool things, like a few new vigor powers, but nothing really too crazy. And then it ends on a bit of a cliffhanger. Burial at Sea 2, however, is much more fun. Here we actually play as Elizabeth, and because she is not the war hero that Booker DeWitt was, she prefers a stealthy approach, and if you play this DLC on a special difficulty mode for it called 1998, you can only go the non-lethal route, which added a fun degree of stealth to it and made it feel like I was playing a bit of a different game. Not to mention that it culminates in a story event that I thought was really cool, which all left me feeling pretty great about the Burial at Sea DLC. Then we have the Clash in the Clouds one. This is less fun, frankly. It is an arena DLC, and if you really enjoy the combat of this game, you'd probably like it quite a bit. But basically, we can go through 4 arenas with 15 waves of enemies each. Each wave has a special blue ribbon challenge that will get you more rewards if you can complete it. And as you go through all of these waves, you'll earn money to upgrade all of the weapons available to you. In between each wave, you can focus on upgrading everything available to you, swapping out weapons, getting ready for the next challenge. And if you enjoyed the combat of this game, I think it's fine. If you want all of the achievements, it gets very grindy very fast, as the blue ribbon challenges, which you need to collect all of for a specific achievement, can get incredibly tedious. After running through each arena just one time, you'll likely have enough money to pay for all of the upgrades available to you, as well as max out the sort of art gallery that they give you to show off some cut development material or models, things like that. Which means for a not insignificant portion of this DLC, if you are going for that achievement, you're likely to be making no progress other than just repeatedly trying these challenges until you get them, which can be less than fun. Some of them are very easy and you can do right away. I got about 20 out of the 60 just from playing through them normally, but some of them, especially in the last arena, are incredibly difficult to pull off and require very specific conditions that are hard to do while also trying not to die. Luckily though, with this being an older game at this point, you can find some very detailed guides to help you out here, which I found very useful. But I would say for Clash in the Clouds, if you like the combat, it's fun, otherwise I can't really recommend it. That does bring us to the Steam Deck section of the video, however, and this game runs very well on the Steam Deck. For some reason, it only has a playable rating, which Steam says is because you have to use the keyboard at certain places that I couldn't ever really find. I'm also not a fan of trying to aim with joysticks, but that's a separate issue. Beyond that, we've got cloud saves, controller support. The game runs very well, even on higher settings, as this is an older game, and I really just didn't have any issues at all playing this on Steam Deck, so despite the just playable rating for Steam, I again, really enjoyed this on the Steam Deck, and I could see someone playing through it on that platform, especially something like Clash in the Clouds. But with all of that out of the way, we are brought to our positives and negatives. For me, the positives of this were the art direction, the steampunk vibe, the world at play, which had and was filled by really interesting characters. A lot of the characters are fun to learn about. It's cool to get their side of the story, especially Elizabeth, who's traveling and interacting with you all of the way through the game. But on the negative side of things, I can't help but feel like this entire game just abandons choice and suspense even, really, just for the sake of streamlined mechanics. We see things like what is effectively a shift in genre as a result. It's a game that really doesn't have any big decisions to make. That means, in spite of what this game does well, I can't help but feel like it's just a roughly 12-hour shooting gallery that doesn't have much more to offer, whereas BioShock 1 and 2 did. And that brings us to our conclusion. My conclusion for BioShock Infinite is that it's a decent story with decent gameplay mechanics that I think pales in comparison to the previous two games. There are parts of it I enjoyed. I think the characters are honestly the big standout, and even the story had its moments that I liked, but mostly it was just all of the decisions to streamline things, make a story that wasn't terribly connected to the first two until the DLC, or things like even just the ability to have only two weapons with you at any given time, all makes the game feel a little less fun for me personally. And while I'm sure there's people out there that enjoy that, for someone who really enjoyed the RPG side of these games more than things like the straight up game mechanics, it's a bit of a bummer to see. Now, as for a recommendation, that becomes a little bit easier for us simply because the game is quite old, which means naturally you can pick it up for cheap pretty regularly. The collection, specifically, which comes with all three games, is normally priced at $50, and whatever that amounts to regionally. It is also on sale pretty regularly, and I was able to pick that up on sale for like $12, which for 3 games is certainly not bad. But for me, I would say BioShock Infinite fails to live up to its predecessor. That is going to do it for me, though. I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.